We're back, and we're here to talk now about the combat in World War I, the actual fighting that happened, and what that fighting was like, what was involved with it, and why World War I ended up being the type of war that it ended up being. So let's get to talking about that, right? So the first thing that we should say is that we talked in our first video about militarism, right? How countries believed in having a strong military as a show of strength, as a show of them being the best, right? Well, part of that whole idea of militarism was creating a plan in case you did go to war. So all these countries had plans in place where if they got attacked or if they wanted to attack, they would be able to say like, okay, let's hit the button on this plan and get rolling, right? The most famous of these plans is what's called the Schlieffen Plan. It was Germany's plan in case they had to go to war, because Germany knew that if they had to go to war, since France and Russia were on the same team, they knew that they'd have to be doing fighting over here, and they knew that they'd have to be doing fighting over here. And fighting on two different sides, just like that, is going to be a challenge. So they had to come up with a plan to deal with that challenge. And that was the Schlieffen Plan, invented by this handsome gentleman right here. And basically what the plan was is they were going to first throw everything they had at France, right? Going through the country of Belgium, taking them by surprise. And their plan was that they'd be hitting France so hard that they'd be able to defeat France in about 6 weeks. And after that quick fighting, they would then take all of their troops and move them east towards Russia to fight the rest of the war. What they didn't really account for was that France had a plan of their own. Fortunately for France, however, and it's kind of odd that I'm going to say this, the French plan was not very good, or at least not as good as the German plan. But this ended up being good for France, because when France started their plan and invaded Germany at the start of the war, they got beaten really badly and were forced to go back to France. But because they went back to France, they were able to kind of take up a defensive position and stop the Germans from actually taking over France, right? So if we look at what actually happened here, the dark arrows are the movements of the German troops going from Germany through Belgium and into France. These white arrows show how the French people tried to attack Germany. You can see they didn't get very far. But what ended up happening is, because they got stopped, they had to go back. And they ended up stopping the German soldiers before they reached the capital city of France, Paris, which was the German goal. The Germans thought that if they could take the capital city, they would win this war, and that France would be forced to surrender. Instead, France had to backtrack, and they set up a defensive position in this area right here. And when they set up a defensive position, they literally dug into the ground to set themselves up to stop the Germans, and the Germans ended up doing the same thing, which is what led to the most notorious type of fighting that took place during this war, and that's trench warfare. And it happened on the Western Front. We call it the Western Front because it's the fighting that happens on the western side of the war. The fighting between France and Germany right here, that's going to be called the Western Front. The Eastern Front is going to be the fighting that happens between Russia and Germany over here. Okay. So on the Western Front, you have trench warfare, where both sides, the Germans and the French and British, dug into the ground and protected themselves and tried to stop their enemy from gaining any new ground. And this type of fighting was especially deadly. As I mentioned here, you could lose hundreds of thousands of lives to gain a couple hundred feet in this type of warfare because of the way things worked out. Lots of new weapons were used. Machine guns were used in the first real way. Chemical weapons like poisonous gases were used. Barbed wire was used for the first time in combat. And all of these things were quite dangerous when you figure out how this whole thing worked. This diagram kind of shows us that. Let's imagine that your enemy is over here to the left. right? And this is your base. Your base is going to have something called a front line trench. You can see it running along here. This is going to be where your soldiers who are actually doing the fighting are going to be. And they'd have machine guns set up, and they'd be pointing their guns at your enemy over here, right? But sometimes your general or your commander would say to go over the top, which means to go out of your trench and into this area here called no man's land. They called it no man's land because it would be very difficult for any man to survive. This is the open area between your base and your enemy's base. And in this area, it's loaded with barbed wire, landmines, poisonous gas floating around left and right, and of course, machine gun fire coming from your own side as well as the enemy's side. That is why it was so deadly to go out and try and take land, and why it was so difficult to make any progress in this war. On the other side, on the Eastern Front, things were a little bit more offensive, right? There wasn't any trench warfare, but it didn't mean that it was any much less deadly. Indeed, in the 1 year 1915, 2 million casualties occurred in that conflict in that year alone, on that side of the war alone. So the fighting over on the eastern side is no joke. It's just not talked about as much because it was fought in the way that people were used to fighting, kind of being above ground and setting up and, shooting at each other and stuff like that, like in, old war movies. To describe a couple of the battles that happened along the Western Front, we really remember these battles not because they were like glorious or involved any moments of like, I don't know, standing on top of the mountain and declaring victory. We remember them more because of how gruesome they were and how difficult and challenging they were. One such battle is the Battle of Verdun. The Germans tried to attack the French at the place where they probably felt the strongest, and the Germans intentionally did this to try and embarrass the French, to beat them so badly that they would just lose all hope. But the French people did not lose as badly as the Germans expected them to. It ended up being a pretty fair fight, and the French people actually stopped the German soldiers from advancing any further. And the commander at this battle, his name was Henri Pétain. He was quoted as saying to his soldiers, "The Germans, they shall not pass." It ends up becoming something that becomes like a motto for the French people, and his heroism is remembered, and he's actually elected president of France soon after the war ends. And this, famous moment from Lord of the Rings kind of reminds us of that, right? You shall not pass. Another battle to mention is another really kind of terrible defensive battle that resulted in a lot of loss of life. That's the Battle of the Somme. It was fought in the area around France and Belgium. This time it's really the British against the Germans, although there are some French there. The British people, they're fighting trench warfare, right? They're trying to clear out that area we called no man's land to be able to move forward. They try and do that by kind of blowing everything in no man's land up. They can't really successfully do that, and they decide to go and send their men, quote unquote, over the top anyway. And the British and the German people just keep going back and forth with one another, and the slaughter is terrible. The British people lose 21,000 soldiers in the first day of fighting, and by the time the battle, which lasted almost a third of a year, over 140 days, there are 420,000 British people dead, 200,000 French dead, and 600,000 Germans dead, all for a mile and a half of territory. Close to nothing, right? Highlights how defensive this war was instead of aggressive or offensive. There's also a lot of new ways that navies are used in this war. And the way that the navies were used involved new techniques, such as the British people who put a blockade on the German citizens, right? The British people used their military ships to block German ports from receiving things like food and medicine. And that was not aimed at stopping the soldiers directly. In fact, the British people's goal was to more or less starve the non-soldiers in Germany to death, so that these civilians, these German people who weren't actually doing any of the fighting, they wouldn't then be able to produce for the military, and Germany would be forced to surrender. On the other side of the equation, another new thing that happened was the way that the Germans used submarines. Submarines existed before, but they weren't used a whole lot. The German people are really the first to use submarines in a consistent and tactical, strategic way. They use submarines to blow up ships that they feel like their enemies, the British and the French, are using to get supplies to them, right? One time they actually blow up a ship called the Lusitania, which had 118 Americans on board before the Americans actually got involved in this conflict. Now, the Americans didn't really want to fight, but when the Germans blew up the ship with so many Americans on it, that actually made the Americans want to get into the fight at least a little bit for the first time ever, and eventually the United States would join in the war. So that's just another thing that happened in terms of the conflict. So to kind of sum it up, on the Western Front, you had trench warfare where there's a big defensive standoff between these sides, and the new weapons that were developed like machine guns and poison gas and barbed wire, they really stopped one another from making any advances in territory. On the other side of the war, where the Germans are fighting the Russians, there's a little bit more open fighting, so territory is moving back and forth in larger chunks, still deadly. And another new way a new way of fighting that happened in this war was the use of navies in new ways, both like the British did to block German citizens from getting things that they needed to survive, and the German use of submarines to stop the British and French citizens and the British and French militaries from getting the supplies that they needed. All right. See you in the third video for Total War.